especially, I suppose, now since I'm 93 and I don't get interviewed as much as I did. Well, I'm sitting here in Jerusalem on a middling cold day. Things are slightly improved here, and I came from a small town in England called Rugby. This is where they invented rugby football. There's a famous school there, which I didn't go to. There's a famous school there, and they invented this game. And the people who went out to govern the empire took the game with them. So you'll find that it's played in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, countries like that, but not in India. Didn't take on in India because during the summer the ground is too hard, and people got injured. They fell on the ground, and a few crazies played it, but it didn't catch on. The game of cricket, which is another very English game, which only exists in countries where the British Empire was. Anyway, so this is Rugby, and this is the school, and I was at school there, and I lived in the town till I was 18, and I had no idea I would finish up in Israel. There were no Jews in this town. It was only 40,000 people. There was no synagogue. There were one or two occasional Jews, but in school I never met, there was none. And I went to a day school, and I cycled 2 miles to my school and 2 miles back again. And my parents were living a very quiet life. My father was an engineer, and he worked on radar, the discovery of radar. His engineering work was done in a factory which was one of 2 which made radars in 1940.
Wow.
Which were very, very important for the...
So did he work for the World War II? Did he help?
Well, I was there. No, I was only 9.
No, did your father help?
Oh, yes. Well, yes. He had been in the First World War, and he
Wow.
had been wounded, and he got promoted because the engineers who were younger and sometimes better qualified than him went to the army, and so he was in charge of what was called planning. And planning was a really terrible job. The big radars then were not like they became later on. They were huge 8-wheel lorries with about 1,500 parts.
Wow.
And you had to get all the parts together and put them on a conveyor belt, on a belt. And they weren't all made in the factory. They were made by subcontractors, what are called subcontractors.
Wow.
So there were 6 or 7 of those, and there were all these bits, and there was no computer. And they had what were called blueprints, big blue sheets of paper with all the stuff on them.
Oh.
And he used to leave at 9 in the morning, at 7 in the morning, get to the office about 8:30, and then work right through till 7. And during the time from 1940 to 1943 or 44, I hardly ever saw him. He just at weekends.
Wow.
And at weekends he was too tired to do anything. He just watched the computer. He drove a little bit and went on into the country and so on. And I lived a very quiet life. I was a very studious boy. I didn't have problems. Well, I seemed not to have any significant problems when I was a teenager. I just read books, and
Wow.
I had some friends, and but my parents lived a very quiet life. They were not very social people. They played tennis, one thing or another, but not. And then my mother fell ill, and she fell ill when she was quite young, 41, and she was ill until she died, which was about 20 years later, but she was always a sick person, so I got used to that, I'm afraid. Anyway, and then I had some luck. The school I went to was an ordinary secondary school, not bad, not good, but the master who came after the war, taking the place of Colonel Wheeler, who was a really old-fashioned teacher, a good, honest man, but pretty, and this gentleman who came was very idealistic. He wanted to have a school which was different from what he found, and he changed it, and it was my good luck that I was fairly clever, so he took an interest in me, and I had private sessions with him and stuff like that.
Wow.
And he submitted me for a scholarship, first in Cambridge and then in Oxford.
Wow.
Nobody ever did that. From this school, people didn't go. They went to the local universities, Birmingham, whatever. So I went there, and the first time was a terrific failure for a very odd reason, because I wrote, and I did, and then I met a very charming man who interviewed me. He said, well, you know, it's a pity, we thought we can't really take you because your handwriting is so bad that we could only read about half of what you've written.
Who told you that?
The man who was interviewing me. It was true.
At Cambridge or where?
Yeah, in Cambridge, yeah. And it was true. I mean, you know, so I had to reform my handwriting. Then I went back again, and this time I didn't go to Oxford. I had a bit of luck again. I caught flu, and I could still work. So the school got permission from the college for me to sit for 2.5 days or whatever it was, answering papers in a small little room. And I did that, and I wasn't disturbed. You see.
What do you mean answering papers?
Well, the papers were sent, the question papers, the examination papers were sent to the school.
To your high school?
Yes,
oh.
And I sat in a little room there and I just wrote for 2 days, more or less, 2 or 3 days. And that was okay. I didn't get a scholarship, but they let me in. And this was in itself a good thing, because if you got into a college in Oxford, you then got a grant from the state, from the government.
So they did got you in Oxford?
Yes. I let me in to study history. My father was against it. Oh, my
why?
God. Well, he thought, what are you going to... He was an engineer. He didn't read many books or anything. He said, what are you going to do with history? Well, you should come to the factory and study, become an engineer, you know, apprenticeship, or what they call apprenticeship. It was a way of becoming an engineer. And, you know, it was completely idiotic, because I had no skills in engineering.
Oh.
I've never had any skills with my hands.
Were you interested in engineering?
No, I detested it. He used to take me to the factory, and I just couldn't stand the atmosphere. I couldn't stand it, you know. Everybody working and running up and down, and in some parts of the factory, of course, there were furnaces and heat. Well, don't ask. Anyway, so he didn't really give up. He went to the headmaster and said, look, I don't think my son should. He has no money, he has no resources. Although my father was an engineer, he was not well qualified, so his pay was quite small. And so, okay, in the end his resistance broke down. But I had to go in the army first, and I was 2 years in the British Army.
Wow.
A very inglorious period in my life.
Not glorious.
No. I tried to become an officer, but I failed miserably. When we were in officer training, we were given control of a number of fellow candidates, about 20. And we were, for a week, we were sort of in charge to show that we had officer qualities. Well, I didn't show any. The end of my officer career was that I was very slow getting dressed in gymnastics. So I was the last to come out dressed, you know. So I shouted, you know, forward march or whatever it was, but they pretended they didn't hear me. And they marched on, and I ran after them saying, stop marching. And they walked straight out of the camp and onto the main road and blocked it. They did it on purpose. Anyway, they then decided I hadn't got officer qualities at all, which was very true, because, you know, I was 18 and I'd lived a very quiet life. I didn't have... And so then they sent me to the Modi'in, and I was in the Modi'in.
Intelligence.
Yeah, I was in the Modi'in in the War Office. And this suited me quite well. I mean, that was all right, I could do that. And I had a role model. I was a secretary to a colonel, and this colonel was the best dressed man I've ever seen. He was an aristocratic. His father, his uncle, was ADC to the king. Ponsonby. It was a military family. They were all in the army.
Wow.
And he dressed beautifully, and he was most elegant, terribly polite to me. He
wow.
Was, he treated me very nicely. He let me study when there was no work, which sometimes happened. You know, he would let me study the books for the university and things. And he was a disappointed man. He had been captured in Dunkirk and spent 5 years in prison, in German prisons. And that meant he had no career. The army is very unfair. If you don't fight, you don't get promoted. So he had this job. He was in the Royal Corps of Signals Communications. And so he treated things very lightly, and so did I. So I had to educate myself. You see, I knew that because of my limited, I didn't know things. I didn't know anything about classical music. I never went to a classical music concert. I hardly knew what it was. I did go to theatre, but very limited, local theatre.
You went to the theatre while serving in the army?
Yes. You see, I was treated more or less like a civilian. I just went in the morning 5 o'clock and came at 9 o'clock and came back at 5.
Yeah.
And again, of course, there would be some emergency or something. But basically, I could go. I went to the theatre. I went to the National Gallery to see the pictures because I hadn't seen any. There were no pictures in rugby much. So I went there and I went at lunchtime because Colonel Ponsonby used to take quite a long lunch, so I would trot off. The office was, you see, the War Office is just up the road from the National Gallery, so I would go up to the National Gallery and see people. And I got so familiar with some of the pictures, not all of course, that I knew where they were. I could remember exactly where they were. And when I went back to the National Gallery later on, I was fed up. They'd moved them. They weren't in the same place. I couldn't find them. Anyway, so I had a year and a half.
The National Gallery is the museum near Trafalgar or something like this?
It's in Trafalgar Square. It's in the centre of London.
Yeah, I've been there. I've been there for a short time, and I was very impressed.
Well, it's a wonderful collection.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then after I did that, I went to Oxford, and then I had in Oxford a very normal undergraduate career. I think I was very active. It was a big surprise to me. I had never been to a party and held a glass in my hand. I went to family parties, where we sat round a table.
That was during your studies?
When I was young. But when I came to Oxford, of course, it was quite different because there, there were parties and drink and theatre and this and that. So I had a great time. I studied.
I saw that in Oxford, students were studying. Okay. According to what you say, students had a nice time besides.
As well. The system at that time, and it still is basically that, although it's not so. You had a tutor, you had a man who looked after you, and you met him every week, and you did an essay for him. That was the basic building block of the studies, and then you attended lectures and things as well. So I was a fairly successful student. I think I would have been more successful if I'd worked harder, but I wasn't.
And what did you study?
History, English
wow.
history.
Wow.
It was a course which, while it was very okay in some ways, was quite limited. Today it would be considered quite limited. You studied English history and the history of those countries which were part of the British Empire.
Oh.
It meant that you knew a bit about India, you knew a bit about Canada, and of course, you studying English history, you necessarily learned something about the history of France, and you knew a bit about economics. It was a good course, but it was somewhat limited. Today, it's very different. But anyway, so there I was, and I don't know whether to talk about that or not, because we've got a long way to go from here.
Yeah.
But just in short, it was a revelation to me, because I sort of can't realize how little I knew.
Wow.
Because look, I'd read the paper, but I hadn't met anybody, really, except local people in rugby, and some of them were smart and some of them were not. The people who had money in rugby, the schoolmasters in the famous school, I didn't meet them for sure. And so I had a very steep learning curve, not about history so much, because that I knew, but about how to behave, how to go to parties and not get drunk, and how to be a sort of social person. And that was, I think that was a very important part of Oxford at that time. I think it still is, that the way that you study and the way that people treat you makes you more mature. People treated me like an adult, and I hadn't been treated like an adult, I'd been treated like a schoolboy. So it was very different, and I enjoyed it, and I fell in love. Towards the end of my time in Oxford, I fell in love with a woman who was very aristocratic. She was descended from King Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland.
Wow.
They had on their wall a huge family tree. Do you know what a family tree is?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it showed their descent from Robert the Bruce, so about 600 years, something.
Wow.
700 years. And, and I went there to see her parents and all that. And this was another fashla. another mistake, because her father came to Oxford, and we stayed. I met him, and I was looked over, because his daughter had been a debutante. She'd been presented to the Queen. She was high-class aristocracy.
Wow.
So they didn't want her to marry some no good. So he came, and I got on very well with him.
It's not because of your personality. Just you didn't have any kingdom title or something.
Any money or anything. When you become a debutante, the idea is that you will meet young men who are eligible. That is, they have money or titles.
Yeah.
So they didn't much like. Well, he came, and I got on very well with him. He was a very nice man. So then they invited me to their house. And this was quite fun in its way, because I'd never been to a house like that before. It had, it was, the breakfast was served on a huge sideboard covered with silver dishes. I'd never seen a silver dish,
Like in the movies or the series.
It's just like Downton Abbey, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wasn't up to it, you see, because I didn't know how to behave. And I was okay with him, but with her, she was, I only met her once, I never met her again. She carefully dissected, she would ask innocent questions. What does your father do? So I would say, well, he works in a factory. Oh, how interesting.
Why didn't you say that he's an engineer?
Well, I did, I think, but I didn't. It wasn't what she heard was not what she wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And then she'd say, she asked me, had I been abroad? No, I'd never been outside England, and so on. So gradually my personality was shrunk, and of course I didn't realize it because I was not smart about it.
You were innocent.
Yeah, I did, and in some way I didn't pass. And her daughter was only 19, a young woman, very impressionable and so on. And so the whole thing fell to pieces in the end. I mean, just to give you a bit of an example.
Yeah. Yeah.
She told Claire, that was her name, told me, my mother didn't like it. You came down to breakfast in slippers and with the holes in the toes. So I said, oh dear me, I never even thought of it. Stuff like that. There were a number of small signs that I was not part of the aristocracy for sure.
Yeah.
So that relationship broke up and I went to him.
Oh.
And then I think perhaps I made a mistake in a way. I didn't pursue my academic course studies, mainly because I didn't have any money. You see, my parents just didn't have any money. I mean, they couldn't support me in any way, and I didn't want to work in that, try to get the money together. And I didn't do well enough in the exams to get another scholarship from the government. I nearly did. I was within, 2 points or some bloody thing like that. But anyway, it was a good thing, because I wouldn't have made an academic. I didn't have the right type of stickability, the right type of sitting for hours.
Yeah. So you didn't get your first degree?
Yes, I got the degree, okay. It was a good one, but it wasn't enough to get me a decent grant from the government. That's really what came to me.
I don't understand. You got your first degree from Oxford.
I could have gone to a provincial university, but I couldn't get into Oxford.
Yeah.
And I didn't much want it, and it wasn't clear that I would get a grant. I might have done from it.
To get a grant for the second degree.
Yes, but I wasn't, I wasn't really wedded to the idea. So I went off to London and I became a journalist. So
you were a journalist.
But not a very good one, I'm afraid. I did it for 2 or 3 years, but I was deputy editor of a professional paper for teachers.
Wow.
And this was good, and in a way it was rather enjoyable because I travelled to meetings and I wrote reports on educational conferences and stuff like that. But I had then an interview with a man called Tyerman. Tyerman was the editor of The Economist.
Wow.
The Economist is the premier paper of its kind in the country, an international journal. Okay, so I came, and we had a very nice conversation about politics, about this and that. And then he said at the end, he said, but yes, he said, this is all very well. You seem to be well informed and stuff. But he said, we're not going to take you because your writing is not interesting. He didn't like the way I wrote. It was very simple. Not say much about that. So anyway, then... Yeah. Then
for me, it would be very nice if we continue this movie. I mean, it's not meant to be our last meeting. So you can speak about whatever went through your life, which is very interesting.
You're talking about it. Yeah.
And maybe next movie we talk about. But let's. Do you want just to flow and later see?
Well,
okay,
now
that's great.
What I'll do now, I'll skip to the British Council. The British Council.
Rega. So after you've been a journalist in that teacher's journal, you didn't continue your career as a journalist?
No, I understood what he said. I wrote reasonably well, but I was not. You know, to be a journalist, you have to be very alert to what's happening around you, and you also have to write well. You have to write something. My stuff was dull. It wasn't bad. It was just a bit dull, and I had no future there. See, I mean, I could have stayed as a minor journalist the rest of my life, but I had no future as an interesting correspondent.
Yeah.
So I left there and I joined the British Council. That was a story in itself, but I won't tell it now. And
was it difficult to be accepted to the British Council?
Well, it's a process. You know, there's a sort of weekend. You know, you meet, you go there and you hear about it, and you ask questions, and they ask you, and then there's a sort of a board, kind of selection board, and they interview you, and then I was quite lucky. I applied on the day before they were closing the applications for that year, and I got in.
I guess there were many people that wanted to be accepted.
Yes, there were quite a
so why I want to hear about your success stuff, not about only what you see. So what do you think helped you to get in?
Well, first of all, in my opinion, look, other people may not think so.
That's okay.
I'm very articulate. I can talk. Well. And after all, a board is about talking. It's not about doing, luckily. And so anyway, that. And then, you see, again, because I wasn't absolutely typical, I sometimes said things which rather caught their attention. For example, they asked me, I remember the question, they said, if you had a visitor to England, you know, you knew we only had a couple of days, 3 days, what would you do? Where would you take him? What would you show him? It's an interesting question. And I answered it in a way which was not quite typical. I didn't say go to the Tower of London or Oxford, and I said, well, I would take them to Soho. Soho was the lively part of London, which was full of brothels and all sorts. And I'd take him.
I didn't get it. What was Soho like?
It's the name of part of London.
Yeah, I know that.
And it was at that time the place where people went for sex and fun.
Oh.
and then I said, you know, I would take them to some. I would take them to one big country house so they could see something of that kind of life and things of this sort. And I didn't say, you know, I'd take them to Oxford or to see an aircraft factory or whatever. Anyway, whatever I said, it kind of caught their attention, and we had quite a lively meeting. So then I joined, and I married. On the strength of that, I got married to my first wife, and that was because I had an income suddenly, you see. Before journalism, I was miserably paid.
Were you proud that the British Council accepted?
No, I wasn't proud at all. I didn't take it. I was, you see, very ill-focused, really. I just thought, that's good. But I didn't feel that I'd done anything very special. And indeed, I haven't since. I mean, you know, people get into it with this thing all the time. Anyway, and then I got married, and then 2 months later I was sent to Israel. And that's where my relationship with Israel started. I didn't.
What year was it?
1958.
Wow.
And I didn't have any connection with the Jewish world or anything. They sent me there like, well, it was an idiotic procedure really, because they didn't ask me, you know, what I was interested in or anything. They just sent me there. They didn't say, do you know Jews or can you speak Hebrew? Just, you know, this was a sort of training, you see. It wasn't, you didn't get, if you just joined, you didn't get a senior job. You got a non-senior job.
Yeah.
So I came here, and that changed my life. That was changed my, Oxford And then Israel...
Why did Israel change your life?
Well, because I liked it. You see, I'd never lived abroad before. I hardly travelled. By then I'd been to France and so on, but I didn't really travel. And suddenly here was this sunny place with people who were very anxious to get their country known. You see, although I was a very junior diplomat, perhaps the most hardly diplomat at all, because the British Council is linked to the embassy, and I got a diplomatic passport. But I was not a member of the Foreign Office. I was a member of the British Council. The British Council had about 5,000 people all over the world. It was a big organisation, but, you know...
The British Council is 5,000 people?
In all parts of the world.
Totally? No, not in Israel?
No, in the whole world.
Generally,
5,000 people in Israel.
Yeah.
No, it's just the whole world. And it's a good organisation and everything, but you are sort of on the edge of diplomacy, like the Sochnut. It's like the Sochnut in terms of abroad. You know, the Sochnut has offices in New York and
okay.
And it is not strictly part of, but the government pays the salary. Well, the government paid my salary anyway.
Yeah.
And so there I was, and I had a great time.
Where did you live in Israel? In Jerusalem?
Well, I lived at the beginning. I lived in what was it called? On the edge of Ramat Gan. Ramat Yitzhak it was called.
Okay.
And I lived there because I wanted to have a house, not a flat and things. It was not a good choice. It was a rather... But after 2 years, then I moved to Bloch Street in Tel Aviv.
To?
Bloch Street it's called. It's near Weizmann Street in Tel Aviv.
Ah, yeah, in North Tel Aviv.
And I made friends very quickly because I wanted to know everything. One of my friends once said to me, you spent the last 3 years asking questions. And I asked questions, and I wanted, people liked me because I asked questions.
You were curious.
Well, no, I wasn't. I had a lot of work. I mean, I ran 3 libraries and I ran scholarship boards and things like that.
Wow.
At that time, the British Council was quite important in Israel. Today, I'm sorry to say less, but at that time, because Israel was so poor, you see, you don't realize how poor Israel was, because you were growing up when it was. But for example, the British Embassy had a shop. They had a shop. They couldn't drink the local wine. It was really awful. And it was all wine for for kashrut. I mean, it was for Friday evening. It wasn't. I didn't like it. The toothpaste was awful. No nice tooth. So they had a shop. And they had a shop for all the kind of things which Israel didn't do. And the Americans had a supermarket, great big building full of ham and egg. There's also and because of that, and because the British government was helping, and because the country wanted to get known, people gave me much more kavod than I was technically invited to. By the time I left, I knew the editor of Haaretz, Yigal Alon, and other such big wigs, and the presidents of all the big universities, the 2 big universities in Tel Aviv. And, I would arrange a visit to the scholar, like Professor Chain. Professor Chain came to the Weizmann Institute. He was a Hungarian who was in Oxford as a professor, and he was a foremost atomic energy scientist.
Wow.
A physicist. And he came, people like that came for 10 days, and I had to look after them, make sure they met the right people, did the right thing. And then the libraries, we had a book exhibition. Why did we have a book exhibition? Because in Israel, there was no foreign currency. People could not buy a book from abroad in the shops because there wasn't any foreign currency. They couldn't get them. And we supplied magazines, which were also difficult to pay for, to the universities and things. And then we had an exhibition of recent British books in Bet Sokolov.
Wow. Was it popular?
Well, it was opened, by the Deputy Foreign Minister, whose name I can't remember. And, 150 people came to the reception then. Then the next morning, I was cleaning up, you see, because they pulled the books, it was all... suddenly a big, huge car drove up, and out jumped Gurion.
Wow.
He said, I hear there's a book exhibition here. So I said, yes, there is, sir. I recognized him, but of course
Were you excited?
Yes, I was. Also, I was sorry, you see, we didn't have a photographer there or anything. So he came and he said, I want to see the books on archaeology. So that was his hobby, one of his hobbies. he came, well, luckily there were about 50 books on archaeology, and he went through them. And he came to, I'll just tell you this stupid story, but it's quite funny in a way. He said, this book is wrong. So I said, well, you know, what a pity, I said, sort of thing. And he said, look, it says here that so many 50,000 people were at Sinai when Moses got the commandments. He said, that's not true at all. There were only 600. So, you know,
how did he know?
Well, that was his opinion. And you know, he read a lot, you know, Ben-Gurion. He read a great deal. And he read widely. He didn't read science, I think, but he read, you know.
Yeah.
And so we had a brief and inconclusive conversation about this matter, since I knew nothing about it. And he stayed about 20 minutes, half an hour, he went off. And so I reported this to my superiors, and they were kind of rather pleased in a way. They said, oh,
yeah,
great. But I had, then I got a call, what's his name? The president was coming. What was his name?
The president of Israel.
Yes. He was a bookish man. He has an institute here in Jerusalem.
Weizmann?
No, not Weizmann. After Weizmann.
Sharet?
No. I remember it anyway, it doesn't matter. But he was a literary type of man, and there is an institute in Jerusalem in his
Zalman Shazar, maybe?
No, never mind.
Never mind. I don't know it either.
Something Itzhak, I think. Anyway, so he came, and he was very different. He was very literary, and he spent an hour there telling over the books. And
wow.
The place wasn't open, you see, it only opened at 12 o'clock or something. So he had the run of it, and this was nice. And, you know, we were quite friendly. So that was my book experience. But there was a lot of action because Israel was making a country. You know, I went to Tel Aviv University, and there was one building. Which was actually had been built by the Hebrew University. The Hebrew University didn't want Tel Aviv University. It wanted to be both in Israel and they were defeated. You know, because some of them.
They didn't want competition.
No, that's right. But the politicians didn't agree, and so they had to accept. So they handed the building over to Tel Aviv University. But other departments, one was in a secondary school by the bus station, and one was in Jaffa, and you know it was right at the beginning. I mean, there's only been 3 or 4 years, I think, in existence, something like that. And I got to know the president of Zvi Yavitz, a professor who emigrated from the Hebrew University because he wouldn't have become head of a department or anything for many years because most of the people there were quite young. So he went to Tel Aviv and became one of the big wheels there. So I had fun, you know, and I tried.
So you got to know many people who were important in Israel, and maybe you also felt part of the wonderful process of getting Israel to be a country, a state, because Israel, you know, was established on 1948, but I know from other stories that it was very difficult and just
yes, I think that's true.
You help in a way because you were foreign, because you worked for.
Yes, that's true. When I went back after I'd been here 3.5 years, I was invited to talk about Israel by the Jewish Agency, and I did that. My superiors didn't like it. They couldn't.
Why?
Well, they thought I'd gone native, you know, that I was. They didn't think this was what returning diplomats should do. You know?
They thought that you were too much inclined to Israel.
Well, I don't know what they thought, but it didn't do me any good. I mean, they said, you know, do you think you really need to do it? And I cared not a fig for what they thought, and I said, I'm going to do it, and that's it. Nothing happened. Anyway, so that was right.
So didn't resist you going and talking about Israel?
Well, all right. So
I just want to say that we have like 10 minutes.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah.
Right. Well, anyway, so I did what I think was quite my superior, the man who ran the office, was a very interesting and good guy. He afterwards got promoted to all kinds of things. And he liked me. I mean, so this was a very successful time in my life, you know. I lectured in kibbutzim on English literature because I'd taken,
Wow.
when I left Oxford and when I was being a journalist, I took half a doctorate. I never finished it because I was sent to Israel.
Wow.
It was about English literature. So I took another degree in English literature. So I came and I lectured.
Another degree in Oxford?
No, in London University, part-time. And so that was okay. And I lectured.
I guess the kibbutzim at that time were very eager to hear about literature, about
well, you know,
English.
England was still, funnily enough, just worth noting is that although I wasn't Jewish and although England had only left being mandatory for 10, nobody except one person ever sort of criticized England and me, you know. And this was a guy called Yellin Moore. And Yellin Moore was one of the persons who was thought to have killed Bernadotte. And he was an extremist. He was Herut, but I think he was more extreme than Herut. And I met him at a party. See, the host said, "Oh, this is Rovin Flight. He's from the British Army." And he hit my hand down and walked away. And that was the first time anybody had ever criticised the mandate to me. You know, they didn't bother about it. Nobody talked about it. It was just left out.
He hit you as like he was
just,
angry.
No, look, I put out my hand and
Yeah.
he just went boom and knocked it down.
Oh,
Which was,
very polite.
and the host was very embarrassed. But I didn't care. Do you know he was anyway? I only found out afterwards.
Yeah.
And he, of course, hated the British like anything, which was not normal. Most people, I think, although of course I had a rather biased view, most people thought that the British could have been worse. They were pretty awful, and they hated the way they treated the people, sending them to Cyprus and so on. But they thought, you know, I think the French were worse, if you know what I mean.
And the Turkish were worse too.
Well, the Turkish, yes, the Ottoman Empire was just a mess. Anyway, so you know, and so my time in Israel was a very happy time for me. I mean, it was very good. And then I came back, and then I began to get into trouble because I was not getting on too well with my wife, and our child was born deaf. He had meningitis when he was 6 weeks old, and that took away his hearing. And not all of it. He was partially hearing. He had to go to special schools and stuff like that. So I stayed in London longer than I would otherwise have done, because you know I wouldn't do it. And I had an interesting job. I was interviewing people who wanted to join the British Council. They put me up for doing that, which was in a way a vote of confidence, because you know.
Yeah.
So I interviewed, very tiring, in the height of the season, not all of the year round, but I interviewed 8 people a day for an hour each. That's immensely exhausting. By then there were very many applications. They'd take 15 out of 200. So I was interviewing people all the time, and I ran the scholarship boards and things. And so that time, and I had some other jobs, but they're not interesting. And then I was sent back to Israel in 1968. And so...
Did you ask to come back to Israel?
Well, no, but people knew I wouldn't mind if it happened. But I didn't ask. I never said, would have been no good saying, can I go to Israel? There's not that kind
So
of
you were sent to India after the second time you were in Israel?
Oh, much later, yes, much later, 8 years later. And so anyway, so I came back and I was head of the office here. And I think, you know, this was also a good time, but I don't want to go into it because it's not such good stories as the, you know, I was more settled, things were more settled, and that's where I got interested in the environment. And I
was Israel different after the 6 days war?
Yes, it was, but I didn't at once feel it. I mean, there was a great air of enthusiasm and excitement and everything.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I went up to the Golan Heights, and I went here, and I went there. And then I saw that having a few £100,000 in one's pocket, you could do a bit of social engineering. And I got interested in the environment, and I organised with the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem a conference on the environment.
Wow.
There had not been a conference on the environment for. So
Yeah, because people didn't know much about
the Valier Institute. I mean, perhaps there was, but they didn't know about it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Robin, I'll just say, excuse me for stopping you because we have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So, Rega, wait a minute. I want to know, we stopped at about 1968.
Yeah.
Because I want to continue to interview you, so I want to know when did we stop, so we can continue after that, the next interview, if you agree. But I just want you to sum up maybe some of your conclusions or something you can say to younger people about your experience that you've just told me. And after that, we will take a picture together and we will talk for a few minutes about this talk.
Well, B'kitzur, I think that if you work in this kind of human connection, you have to care for the people.
Well,
some of my colleagues criticized me because they thought I was too interested in what was good for Israel and not enough interested in what was good for Britain. But I didn't believe that. I think that if you want to do this kind of semi-diplomatic work and you want to help try to make a better relation between two countries, you have to care for the people. And
yeah.
I said that when I left the British Council, my farewell party, I said this, and some guy said to me, what's all this about love? Because I said, you have to love the people if you can. Sometimes
yeah.
But in India, I worked on the same principle, that if you people felt that you really were interested in their well-being, that you weren't just selling British clothes or British whiskey, but you were doing something which they could benefit from. Then it was
yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I did. And if we have another interview, I'll tell you how I helped to found the Open University.
Well, that's interesting as well.
Which was an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And I also helped to reform the way the universities were funded, set up the but that was in my first time.
Oh.
Things like that.
Yeah.
So I had a bit of social engineering as well as, schwitzing around.
Yeah, yeah.
I also enjoyed parties. I'm one of the few people who likes cocktail parties. Everybody else says, oh, they're awful. I like them. I used to go around trying to see as many people as I could and chat them up.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I would say that if you want to work abroad, or you want to do any kind of NGO work, you have to care for the people with whom you are working.
Yeah.
It isn't, you can't be made Prime Minister. You have to be interested in their well-being. Otherwise you're just wasting your time, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you, because this is a lesson that I'm learning not only from you, but from a relative of mine that I've interviewed here like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she also established some very interesting things in Israel, and she also said, I work with staff. We had good relationships, so this kind of, relationship in your work, it makes you succeed. This is going up again. But I want to thank you, Robin. It was very interesting.
Good.
And it's very interesting to hear about your career and about the fact that you loved Israel and about those times that I only heard about it and how you felt here in Israel. It's very interesting. Well, and so now we have to sum up and then we talk with each other, okay? Mm-hmm. So now thank you from Jerusalem and we will continue.